Previously, in the life of Hideo Kojima, with the release of Metal Gear, he and Konami had a certifiable hit on their hands. Between its sales success and the post-credits tease, you might expect Konami to fast-track a sequel. And you'd be right, except that Kojima wouldn't be involved and it would only be released in the Western market. Metal Gear 2 Snake's Revenge is an odd piece of gaming history and one that I'm not particularly interested in. Luckily, Kojima had also begun working on his own sequel of sorts. No, not Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake, that would come later. Instead, it was something a bit different. Enter Snatcher. Unlike his previous gameplay first endeavors, Snatcher was going to be Kojima's first go at placing story and characters at the forefront. It was, after all, a visual novel/adventure game. Without the typical constraints of contextualizing a narrative within the confines of established gameplay systems, Kojima, along with character designer Tomiharu Kinoshita, were able to better realize their goal of constructing a focused, linear narrative that had more in common with anime and film than video games at the time. And the genre they tackled with this newfound freedom was none other than cyberpunk. Taking inspiration from the likes of Ridley Scott's Blade Runner and Katsuhiro Otomo's Akira, Snatcher naturally evolved over the course of its initial 18-month development into something heavier, more thought-provoking than many of its contemporaries. It also allowed Kojima to stretch his legs as a writer. Those Kojima-isms that we only got brief glimpses of in Metal Gear are much more pronounced here. Think political commentary, fourth wall breaks, questionable choices with regards to interactions with women, the works. However, the initial release of Snatcher was unfinished. The game was planned to have 5 acts, but only shipped with 2 due to memory constraints with their platform of choice, the PC-8801, though it would also release on the MSX2 at Konami's behest. The game thus ended on a cliffhanger that was intended to be resolved with a sequel that would cover the remaining 3 acts. However, the game's protracted development cycle for the time led Konami to squash any sequel plans. What we got instead was a chibi RPG adaptation called SD Snatcher. This is significant as SD Snatcher featured more story content that would later go on to be the basis for the 3rd act that was included in subsequent home console ports. The first port to feature this additional content was for the PC Engine, released in 1992. This was followed by a Western-only port for the Sega CD in 1994/1995, which just so happens to be the version I will be covering today. Lastly, there were ports to the PS1 and Sega Saturn that unfortunately never left Japan. As for my own history with the title, I have virtually none. This is a game that for many years I assumed I just wouldn't get to play despite being a fan of both Cyberpunk and Kojima. I never had a Sega CD growing up or much interest in shelling out for one now that I'm an adult, especially since the main game I would want for it, Snatcher, sells for north of $1,000 on the secondary market. I've made my fair share of inadvisable game purchases in the pursuit of filling out my collection, but even I can't stomach prices that high. Luckily for me, there are ways around such issues, ones that, I'd argue, are very much befitting of the cyberpunk genre. And so, I come to you today having finally played through Hideo Kojima's Snatcher from start to finish. Between the critical acclaim it received at launch and its standing as a prominent and influential cult classic, a question inevitably arises: does it still hold up? Both as a member of the menagerie that makes up the works of Hideo Kojima and amidst the modern gaming landscape. Before we answer that question, please allow me a moment to shill this channel. I love what I do here at llamelion Gaming, and if I'm being honest, it's a dream of mine to one day make this my full-time gig. In order to do that, I require the assistance of all of you fine folks watching. So if you enjoy my work, please consider subscribing, sharing the video around, liking, commenting, all that good stuff. Every little bit helps and genuinely means more to me than I could possibly put into words. Now with that said, let's get back to Snatcher. 1996, Moscow. Deep in the heart of the Kremlin, scientists toil away crafting something so devastating that it bears the name of he who fell from heaven, Lucifer Alpha. A deadly pathogen courtesy of the brightest minds Russia could find. Contained, it is a threat and bargaining tool, but no evil can be contained for long. The circumstances of its release are unknown, but more important is the devastation left in its wake. Unleashed into the atmosphere, Lucifer Alpha quickly spread across Asia and Europe, killing over half the world's population. Over time, the pathogen would mutate into a non-lethal form, but the effects of what would come to be known as the catastrophe echoes through time to the present day as remnants of this past still haunt those who yet live. The catastrophe rendered the area it infected uninhabitable for many years. However, by the year 2044, the Siberian Neutral Zone, as it is now known, is safe enough that governments of the world have begun sending in investigative teams to see what might be waiting for them in the wasteland once called Russia. During one of these investigations, a couple is found, Gillian and Jamie Seed. As they awake from cryogenic sleep, they find all memories of their previous lives have been robbed of them by their extended stay in the cold. Even still, one word remains at the forefront of their minds: Snatcher. Not long before these two were discovered, reports of beings known as Snatchers first started coming in. Snatchers are android lifeforms with the ability to take on the likeness of any individual within set parameters. They pick their victims from amongst influential members of society, killing them and taking their place. The replication process is near flawless, with the only catch being that their artificial skin is prone to developing melanoma when exposed to solar radiation. Because of this, as of now, they operate almost exclusively during the winter and have been confined to Nyokobe, a man-made island and city off the coast of Japan. 3 years later, Gillian and Jamie have yet to recall any of their memories and as such have had trouble reconnecting. What basis is there for a relationship when you can't even remember what drew you together in the first place? Between this and the nagging sensation that learning more about Snatchers will lead them to discover the truth of their pasts, Gillian accepts an invitation to join Junker, a task force headquartered in Nyokobe that specializes in tracking down and eliminating Snatchers. Accompanied by his robotic partner Metal Gear Mark II, Gillian attempts to unravel the mystery of his past, the origins and goals of the Snatchers, and how the two are linked. This is just the setup, given to you within the first 5 to 10 minutes of the game, so as you can tell it's a bit more involved than Kojima's previous work. That said, aside from the backstory, the narrative is pretty straightforward throughout its first 2 acts. Early on, a fellow junker named Gibson is closing in on something big and calls in Gillian for help. Gibson is sadly killed before Gillian can arrive, and thus the rest of the first 2 acts are spent piecing together what Gibson learned by way of retracing his steps, tracking down contacts, interviewing family and friends, etc., before things take a turn in the 3rd act. To be honest, I found a good number of the twists to be overly telegraphed and pretty easy to intuit. Those that weren't felt somewhat out of left field. Nothing egregious, just not set up super well, which could be due to the fact that acts 3 through 5 were initially cut, with a new 3rd act being added later. The biggest victim of this is the main villain, who only appears in the final act and gives a 10 to 15 minute monologue laying out every detail of their backstory and motivation. Because of the way it was presented, I found them a tad petty and not in an interesting way. More so, the scale of their actions didn't align with how mundane I found their motivations to be. I'm dancing around specifics to avoid spoilers. As a visual novel/adventure game, the story is kind of the reason to play this. And I do think that what's here is compelling. I just wish the team had gotten to tell the story in the way they wanted to. Or better yet, if they'd gotten to rework the game a few years later. I could easily see a post-MGS Kojima better foreshadowing where the narrative was going and adding some meat to the relationships at play so that the villain could be more compelling and maybe even sympathetic. The reason why I harp on this so much is because I genuinely like a lot of the characters and their interactions elsewhere in the game, so this particular failing stood out all the more. Gillian and Metal's banter throughout, for example, is a ton of fun, oscillating between silly nonsense and serious as the situation calls for it. Similarly, Gillian and Jamie's conversations really hit home the sort of strained desire to be together despite their circumstances, making that impossible, what between lost memories, murdered coworkers, and identity-stealing androids. There's also little character beats with the likes of Mika the junker receptionist and the informant Napoleon that endeared both to me. Mika tries to be upbeat and helpful but is struggling as things begin to unravel around her. Meanwhile, Napoleon gets a lot more characterization than I thought he would. We learn everything from how he got his name to where he works when he's not providing info. I now have to address the Kojima-ism in the room. When given the chance, Kojima will inevitably give in to his baser instincts, and in this case that takes the form of plenty of opportunities for Gillian to pester any and all women that he comes across. This was actually toned down for the Western release along with the removal of some nudity. I am not against this kind of thing in games, I am a Kotaro Uchikoshi fan after all, but where it feels like a part of, say, Kaname Date's character in the Somnium Files, here and in a lot of Kojima's works, these elements feel less like character choices and more there for the writer's own satisfaction. And that way it frequently comes off as sleazy and unnecessary. Ultimately, as a visual novel/adventure game, your enjoyment of Snatcher largely comes down to the narrative and characters, and in spite of what issues I may have with it, I would say it succeeds on this front. While Kojima is still very much refining his voice, he is more confident here as he begins flirting with complexity and nuance. He just hasn't fully stuck the landing yet. Even with his occasional writing foibles, the characters shine through and are a delightful bunch that grew on me as the game progressed. I'm disappointed we never got more from this world and cast in this form, as I would have loved to have had the chance to spend a bit more time getting to know them all. Look at this little pixel Santa, just chilling in the big city. Delightful. I have a confession to make. While I adore pixel art, I tend to have a hard time emotionally connecting with characters when they're like 12 pixels tall. It's part of the reason why stuff like The Legend of Zelda, Link to the Past, and Chrono Trigger just don't hit with me in the same way that The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword and Chrono Cross do. A good way to overcome this, however, is to use those pixels to gorgeously render your characters in detailed portraits during every dialogue exchange. Each character design is drenched in that 80s anime aesthetic, the city is awash in the neon futurism cyberpunk writers told us the 21st century held in store. Every perfectly placed pixel paints it all in a way that is so emblematic of the time without feeling dated. My biggest criticism has to be that a lot of the character designs are on the generic side, or straight cribbed from elsewhere, like Gillian is just Deckard from Blade Runner. But even then, their varied sprites and reactions give them enough personality apart from their inspirations that, combined with the solid writing, means they become their own distinct characters by the end. As for the sound, this is the first game in a while that I've covered that had voice acting, and man, did I pick a fun one to come back on. What's here is so wonderfully cheesy, but not incompetent, which is saying something for a game released in 1992. The only performance that negatively stuck out to me was Katrina, though that's because it was clearly someone who isn't a teenager attempting to sound like one, and it just didn't work.
Oh, Mr. Seed, I appreciate your feelings, but I was always ready for the worst with my father. Every day as I watched him leave for work, will it be today, tomorrow, I knew it was a dangerous job.
But this game has like 7 total voice actors for over 24 roles, so the fact that so many do work for me is kind of a miracle. Heck, if it wasn't for Jeff Lupetin and Lucy Childs, I doubt I would have found Gillian and Metal half as charming as I did.
You definitely had that coming to you.
Oh yeah? Well, I didn't exactly see you close your eyes either.
That is because my optical sensors are not equipped with retractable shutters.
Oh, shut up. You know exactly what I mean.
One knock on the voice front that has nothing to do with the talent is the lip syncing. This could be due to the version I played, but there were some scenes that went way off. We're talking a couple second difference between lip flaps and spoken dialogue, resulting in instances where one character would speak while another's mouth was moving. This typically occurred during major story moments, which got distracting and cut some of the tension and impact these scenes otherwise would have had.
Or if we can find some kind of patient records there, we may be able to find them quite easily.
So, Little John's memory might provide us with an important lead.
That's right.
As for the music, so many tracks ooze those jazzy city pop vibes I just cannot get enough of. I can't imagine anyone sitting through the opening theme one night in Yokobe City and not being all in from then on. Even when the tone mellows out with tracks like Junker HQ and Theme of Jamie, composer Masahiro Ikariko manages to channel exactly the emotions that you picture running through the characters' heads, from the mundanity of the day-to-day to the complicated comfort that comes from speaking with a loved one. But when the tracks don't hit, which is rare, they kind of fall off a cliff in a I need to hurry up and finish this section because the music is annoying the hell out of me kind of way. There are just some repeated melodies and harsh notes pitched just a smidge too high in the mix. Stuff like Gillian's Apartment gives me a headache just thinking about it. Most of the tracks that fall into this category are intended to put you on edge, but that doesn't mean they should be unpleasant to listen to. Here's where the adventure portion of the visual novel/adventure game designation comes into play, as while the story is without a doubt the main focus, you are an investigator after all, and as such the team behind Snatcher saw fit to grant you a list of verbs every Dick Gumshoe should have in their arsenal. These verbs include, but are not limited to, look, investigate, ask, possessions, exit, etc. Using these, you enter an area, exhaust all dialogue options, hopefully learn some new piece of information to further your investigation, then progress to the next scene. One way this game shows its age is there's no indication that you've seen all of the dialogue for a given option. Typically, games nowadays gray out or remove options when no new dialogue is available. Without that, you may need to choose the same option multiple times to get more dialogue, and your only way of doing that is to run through each a couple times to check. Luckily, this is a rare occurrence, and generally I found the progression to be fairly intuitive and well communicated. I think there were only 1 or 2 instances where I was uncertain of what I needed to do to move forward, but even then it didn't take too long to figure out what I was missing. Something these sections excel at, especially in the mid-game, is letting you play the detective tracking down and investigating leads. One of my favorite examples is how you get in contact with Gibson's informant, Napoleon. After Gibson's death, you find Harry, Junker's engineer, passed out holding a bottle of brandy, which he doesn't typically drink. On the bottle is a string of numbers. You're free to ignore these, or if you remember that you have a phone available, you can try dialing the number. If you do, you will reach Napoleon, but then he asks for a password before he'll speak to you, requiring you to explore and consider what you have at your disposal for gathering information. In hindsight, the breadcrumbs are pretty obvious and they eventually outright tell you what you need to do, but that didn't stop me from feeling like a genius as the game provided enough space for me to pick up on each clue and put them together myself. Then there's the action sequences. Several times over the course of the game, a 3x3 grid will appear on screen, and Gillian will be tasked with aiming his blaster and eliminating targets as they appear on the grid. On the normal difficulty, enemies dole out a decent amount of damage, but you're typically given ample time to take them out before they're able to get a shot off themselves, so most sections aren't all that difficult. Note that I say most because this quickly changes in the lead up to the finale. There are two types of enemies in the game, the humanoid snatchers and small robotic drones called insectors. Prior to entering the final area, you're presented with back-to-back action sequences, the first against a wave of insectors with the second against snatchers. Funny enough, I managed to take out the snatchers with little issue. It's the preceding insectors where the designers decided they hate you. They throw so many of them at you in such quick succession that missing a single one is liable to throw off your groove, resulting in Gillian taking a string of blows and an almost guaranteed game over. It must have taken me over a half dozen tries before I finally got it, and even then I had to be perfect to do so. I get wanting to ramp things up in the final stretch, but when your game leans so heavily on narrative, these kinds of difficulty spikes only serve to dissuade players from seeing the ending you put so much time and effort into getting them invested in. Snatcher is a fascinating little step back in time, both for the genre in which it operates and for the lead creator at its helm. It's easy to look at it and see it as just another visual novel / adventure game. We're not hurting for those these days, but when you remember that it came out over 35 years ago, it's incredible how it not only lacks so much of the obtuseness common in the genre before and after its release, but is still perfectly playable today. And as far as Kojima goes, this kind of feels like where he's most at home. If it wasn't for Metal Gear 2, both versions, I'll get to that story one day, I could easily see him sticking with this genre much longer than he did. As it stands, this and Policenauts are a bit of a what if, a glimpse at an alternate path Kojima could have taken. But would I recommend Snatcher today? Yeah, absolutely. It helps that it's short, only about 8 to 9 hours, and moves at a steady beat with little to no distractions. It's honestly kind of a perfect game to watch. Since it is so story focused, you're not missing out on anything by popping on a Let's Play or hopping into a stream and treating it like an extended movie. If you do decide to play it yourself, the main issue you'll face is that, as mentioned in the intro, it's not easy to get your hands on a physical copy without paying exorbitant markups, in addition to not being available for purchase on any digital storefront. Because of that, emulation is your only real option until Konami decides to port it to modern platforms. But for Kojima heads, visual novel / adventure game enjoyers, or just folks who like a decent story with fun characters, definitely consider taking a trip out to Neo Kobe. You won't regret this day. And with all of that said, thank you so much for watching. It was a treat to finally get to play this after hearing about it and seeing that iconic screenshot of Gillian with his blaster for so many years. I'll be taking a break from Kojima for a while, but don't worry, we'll be back eventually, and when I do return, it'll be with Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake, a game I cannot wait to sing the praises of. For now though, please take care of yourselves, and next time we'll be making for the UK as I set out to explore a haunted monastery in Wales.